The studio fell into a tense, almost reverent silence as Judge Jeanine Pirro leaned forward, her signature glare piercing through the blazing lights of her Fox News courtroom set. The crimson and navy design, crafted to mimic the gravitas of real courtrooms, gleamed beneath the cameras, radiating an aura of power and control that she had cultivated over years on television. Across from her sat New York State Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani, cool and collected in a charcoal Nehru collar jacket, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. His mere presence on Pirro's show was unexpected, and what happened next would stun the audience into silence. The nearly 200-person studio crowd, many of them longtime fans of Judge Pirro's fiery monologues, had come expecting the usual spectacle. Pirro would skewer her guest with piercing commentary, deliver a scathing takedown about law and order, and the progressive politician in the hot seat would either retreat, deflect, or crumble. What they didn't expect was a reversal of roles that would become broadcast history. "Assemblyman Mamdani," Pirro began, her voice rich with controlled contempt, honed through decades as a prosecutor, judge, and conservative media force. "You speak of justice, but your record tells a different story. Are you here to defend your radical proposals, or just to spin them into something palatable for your Twitter followers?" An audible murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't meant to be a debate. It was framed as a civil conversation about policing and prison reform. But Pirro had other intentions. She wanted to put this young socialist in his place, to prove that passion and protest were no match for courtroom grit and American tradition. But what she didn't expect was for Mamdani to smile, not nervously, not defensively, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had walked into this confrontation fully prepared. "Judge Pirro," he said evenly, his voice calm, almost disarmingly polite. "Before you interrogate my record, perhaps we should have an honest conversation about yours, because I've come with documents that might just surprise your audience and your producers." The camera immediately zoomed in on Pirro's face. Her smirk faltered. In the control booth, a flurry of voices buzzed through headsets. Camera angles shifted. This was no longer a controlled Fox segment. It was quickly turning into a high-stakes confrontation. Before we dive into how Zohran Mamdani dismantled Judge Jeanine Pirro on her own turf, make sure to comment where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss any more political showdowns like this. You're about to witness something truly unprecedented. The buildup had been months in the making, though neither of them fully realized it. Pirro had spent weeks, even years, railing against what she called #politicians. Young, loud progressives who she claimed cared more about going viral than passing real policy. She mocked them often. "Some of these so-called lawmakers think followers equal legislation," she'd scoff on her show. While she never named Mamdani directly, political analysts and viewers knew who her barbs were targeting. Young socialists like him, with brown skin and bold ideas, who represented a generational shift she clearly resented. Mamdani, for his part, had remained silent, publicly. His staff encouraged him to respond. He didn't. Instead, he studied her, waited, prepared. Because Zohran Mamdani, before politics, was an organizer, someone trained to win through discipline, clarity, and timing. His plan wasn't to react, but to respond, not emotionally, but strategically. To understand the full shock of what unfolded on that stage, you have to know who these two are and why this battle was inevitable. Pirro's show, Justice with Judge Jeanine, had been a mainstay of conservative media for over a decade, turning her into one of the most recognizable faces in right-wing television. Millions of loyal viewers saw her not just as a commentator, but as a righteous warrior for law and order, a tough-talking former judge unafraid to say it like it is. At 72, she had heard every excuse, dismissed every so-called reformer, and prided herself on cutting through liberal talking points with fiery monologues and unforgiving questions. But Jeanine Pirro wasn't just a media figure. She was deeply political, an outspoken defender of Trump-era conservatism, and a vocal critic of what she derisively called performative progressivism. For months leading up to this confrontation, she had taken aim at young left-wing politicians who, in her words, cared more about retweets than results. Though she never named names, her attacks had the tone and timing of someone itching for a direct clash with figures like Zohran Mamdani. On multiple broadcasts, Pirro mocked young radicals in state legislatures who proposed abolishing ICE, defunding police departments, or siding with Palestinian resistance. "These aren't lawmakers," she said once. "They're online influencers with office space." Her audience lapped it up. Political observers, however, began to notice that she was laying the rhetorical groundwork for a very specific target. That target was now sitting across from her. Zohran Mamdani, 32, hadn't come from wealth, political dynasties, or elite law firms. He was a son of immigrants, a community organizer, a democratic socialist who'd won his Queens district through door-knocking, rent strikes, and grassroots momentum. And unlike many young politicians, Mamdani hadn't entered politics to climb ladders. He came to tear them down. Before politics, Mamdani worked in housing justice, organizing tenants to fight predatory landlords. His rise was meteoric but earned, not gifted. He was articulate, data-driven, and fiercely principled. And like Crockett in the original tale, Mamdani's strength came not just from what he believed, but from how methodically he could argue it. He also understood power and how to confront it. While most freshman lawmakers spent their early years learning the rules and avoiding the spotlight, Mamdani had done the opposite. He was vocal, unapologetic, and fearless in committee hearings, often taking on establishment Democrats with the same precision he used on Republicans. His comments about U.S. foreign policy, particularly Israel and Palestine, had made him both a hero to progressives and a target for conservatives. He'd seen the traps coming, and he'd prepared. This televised confrontation was more than a debate. It was a collision of two worldviews. On one side, Pirro, the law and order traditionalist, forged in the flames of the 1990s crime panic and hardened by years in right-wing media. On the other, Mamdani, the anti-capitalist disruptor with a global conscience and an unshakable calm under fire. What made it even more volatile was that, on paper, they had some things in common. Both came from tough, working-class environments. Both had carved reputations as passionate advocates. Both knew how to command a room, but they represented diametrically opposed philosophies of justice. The set, too, wasn't neutral. It was Pirro's turf. The flags, the eagle motifs, the solemn courtroom backdrop, all designed to confer authority onto her persona. The audience was handpicked for loyalty. The lighting, the angles, the pacing all tilted in her favor, but Mamdani had done his homework. Jeanine Pirro thought she was springing a trap. What she didn't realize was that she was walking into one, painstakingly prepared by someone who knew both politics and optics better than she expected. As the cameras rolled and the hot lights burned, Pirro struck with her opening salvo, measured, sharp, and dripping with veteran confidence. She was used to catching guests off guard, but this time she wasn't the only one who came prepared. Judge Pirro had spent the previous week preparing meticulously for this moment. She and her producers pored over every speech, interview, and bill Zohran Mamdani had touched. Her research team assembled a thick dossier packed with charts on legislative inaction, quotes from Mamdani's critics, and what they believed were silver bullet moments showing he cared more about media buzz than meaningful change. The strategy was clear. Leverage her decades of media dominance in the controlled environment of her own studio to corner Mamdani, to paint him as an inexperienced ideologue with big rhetoric but no real impact. She would use the full force of her persona, her brand, and her platform to remind him and the audience who held the power in this room. What Pirro and her team failed to realize, however, was that Zohran Mamdani had been preparing for moments like this his entire career. Years of community organizing had sharpened his strategic thinking. His training in public housing fights had taught him how to face off against hostile landlords, lawyers, and bureaucrats. And more importantly, his socialist worldview had prepared him for confrontation, not just political, but moral. Pirro leaned back confidently in her judge's chair, a glint of theatrical righteousness in her eyes. "Assemblyman Mamdani," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism, "you've been in the New York Assembly for nearly 3 years now. You've introduced bills, posted your speeches online, and made a lot of noise on Twitter. But let me ask you plainly, what have you actually done? What legislation have you passed that's improved a single person's life? The audience murmured in agreement. Classic Pirro, blunt, surgical, unfiltered. Her voice, cold and legalistic, had taken down dozens of liberal guests before. She expected the same now, but Mamdani didn't flinch. Judge Pirro, he said calmly, folding his hands before him, I appreciate the question, and I'd be happy to walk through my legislative record. But before I do, may I ask, when was the last time you stepped foot in a real courtroom to argue a case, instead of turning justice into a performance under studio lights? The room went still. The question didn't land like a jab, it landed like a challenge. The audience shifted, even some of Pirro's fans looked momentarily uncertain. Pirro's eyes narrowed. I've been fighting for justice longer than you've been out of high school, she snapped. My courtroom may be on television now, but the values are the same. Don't dodge the question. I'm not dodging, Mamdani replied smoothly. I'm giving context, because unlike TV segments that last 6 minutes, real legislative work takes time. It takes negotiation, coalition building, and facing opposition, not just commentary from behind a desk. There was a visible shift in the room. Pirro's crew behind the scenes began exchanging looks. This wasn't unfolding like their usual broadcast rhythm. Pirro tightened her grip on her notes and leaned in. All right, let's get specific then. Your Tenant Protection Act, the one you keep promoting on social media, has been sitting in committee for almost a year with no floor vote. Meanwhile, working families are still facing evictions every day. Isn't that just performance politics? Now she was back in familiar territory, calling out what she saw as empty activism. She expected Mamdani to falter, maybe launch into a generic defense. But instead, Mamdani leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening with conviction. Well, since you want to talk about that bill, he began, let's talk about something your viewers might find interesting. 3 weeks ago, your production company, Pirro Media LLC, signed a $2.3 million strategic consulting deal with the Corporate Landlord Association, the same group that spent millions lobbying against the very housing protections my bill includes. Gasps, the audience collectively stiffened. Phones rose, heads turned toward Pirro, whose smile froze mid-expression. Her carefully composed poise cracked ever so slightly. Camera operators instinctively zoomed in. My bill may be stuck in committee, Mamdani continued, but I'm not taking money from the people profiting off homelessness while preaching about justice on television. Pirro jolted upright, visibly rattled. How dare you come onto my show and throw around baseless accusations? You have no idea what you're talking about. But Mamdani was just getting started. From his bag, he casually pulled out a folder, thick and worn, filled with highlighted pages and clipped documents. The kind of preparation you don't bring unless you intend to go to war. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, he said, flipping it open with surgical grace. Unlike some people, I do my homework. The audience was spellbound. The tension in the studio was electric. Phones flashed. Social media alerts were already pinging across devices as the first clips began spreading online. This wasn't just a political confrontation anymore. It was a live reckoning. What had started as a typical segment had now unraveled into a full-scale confrontation, and everyone could feel it. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Camera operators instinctively crept in closer, their lenses locked on the unfolding drama. In the control room, frantic voices debated whether to cut to commercial. But ratings were surging like never before, so they let it ride. The contract is public record, Mamdani said coolly, opening the folder with practiced calm. The slow, deliberate motion of someone who had walked into 1,000 confrontations and always came with receipts. Signed it just 3 weeks ago, the same week you began your media tour slamming tenant protections and rent control. Interesting timing, don't you think? Judge Pirro's face went crimson, and for the first time in her storied television career, viewers saw her lose her grip. Her usual smirk gave way to clenched teeth. Her eyes darted off camera. My business has nothing to do with my beliefs, she snapped. I've been fighting for justice since before you were born. Have you, though? Mamdani countered, and now his voice took on the razor-sharp tone of a prosecutor cornering a hostile witness. Because I brought something else your viewers might want to see. He reached into his briefcase again. The room held its breath. Phones rose into the air. The faint buzz of a dozen notifications pinged as the first viral clips hit social media. Judge Pirro sat back, hands gripping her desk. For the first time since her rise to media prominence, she wasn't steering the conversation. "What I'm about to show you," Mamdani said, holding the audience in suspense, "will change how we talk about justice in this country and who's truly advocating for it versus who's just selling it as a brand." He stood. With measured steps, he walked toward the bench like a trial lawyer approaching a cornered witness. Every click of his shoes echoed through the dead silent studio. Even the most seasoned Fox camera operators knew they were filming history. This wasn't a typical guest exchange. It was a strategic takedown, methodically crafted by someone who had studied not only the issue, but the arena. "Judge Pirro," Mamdani began, voice steady but firm, "you asked me about my legislative work. Fair question, but before I answer, I think your audience deserves to understand the real reason you're asking it." The way he said real made people lean forward involuntarily. "That's what," he continued, holding up a page for the cameras to zoom in on, "is a contract between your company, Pirro Media LLC, and the National Housing Strategy Group, one of the most powerful landlord lobbying organizations in the country, $2.3 million over 3 years, labeled as Strategic Media Consulting and Narrative Management." The audience gasped. Several people pulled out their phones to start recording. Pirro's expression shifted rapidly. Surprise, fury, and for a fleeting second, fear. "That's a business agreement," she barked. "It has nothing to do with my show or what I believe in." Mamdani's smile was calm, not smug, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated. "Really?" he said. "Because this email, from the lobbying group's VP of Government Affairs to your senior producer, suggests otherwise. Shall I read it?" "You can't just..." Pirro tried to cut him off, but he was already speaking. "Thank you for agreeing to help shift the narrative on housing reform. The recent push by progressive legislators like Mamdani is threatening our business model. Having Judge Pirro publicly challenge their effectiveness is critical to our national messaging strategy." The studio exploded. Viewers at home could hear the eruption, murmurs, gasps, raised voices. Pirro looked as if she had been struck. But Mamdani wasn't finished. "Judge," he said, locking eyes with Pirro, "you questioned my effectiveness as a legislator. You asked what I've accomplished while I've been advocating for housing justice. So let me show you exactly what I've been doing while you've been taking money from the same corporations that profit off evictions and homelessness." He reached once more into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of neatly bound papers. "This is the Tenant Dignity and Defense Act," he said, holding the document high enough for the cameras to zoom in. "I've co-sponsored this bill with lawmakers from both parties. It's designed to cut New York's eviction rate in half by expanding rent stabilization, legal aid access, and tenant protections statewide." The crowd leaned forward, silent. "This," Mamdani continued, raising a second folder, "is the Landlord Transparency and Oversight Bill. It ties state housing subsidies to full disclosure of corporate ownership and rent histories." He held up a third. "And this is the Public Housing Reinvestment Act. It would inject $4.5 billion into crumbling NYCHA buildings without handing control over to private developers." Pirro tried to interject. "Those are just bills," she said with a scoff, her tone sharp. "Anyone can draft a bill. You haven't passed a thing." "You're right," Mamdani said without skipping a beat. "Anyone can draft a bill, but not everyone gets them out of committee, through industry resistance, and into active negotiations." He paused, voice steady. "The Tenant Dignity Act passed the Assembly floor 3 weeks ago with bipartisan support. The Public Housing Reinvestment Act is being fast-tracked through the Senate's Housing Committee as we speak." The audience erupted. Some clapped, others stood. But Mamdani lifted a hand and gently waved them down. "Here's what really matters, Judge Pirro," he said. "While you've been sitting in a studio for over a decade talking about justice, while cashing checks from the very industries making people homeless, I've been in actual housing courts, fighting for tenants. I've stopped illegal evictions. I've held slumlords accountable. I've passed funding increases for legal aid when you were calling tenant protections handouts on air." He stepped forward, his voice rising. "You want to talk about Twitter? Sure, let's talk about how I use social media to expose horrific conditions in Queens public housing. Mold, rats, broken heat, and that pressure led to $80 million in emergency state funding." He took another step. "Let's talk about how my viral hearings forced property managers into state oversight reviews. 3 executives are under investigation right now because of that work. That's not optics. That's results." Pirro leaned back. For the first time, she looked truly outmatched. "You came at me today thinking you could humiliate a young politician who doesn't know his place," Mamdani continued. "But what you didn't realize is, I've been preparing for bullies like you my entire life." The room was silent, and he turned now to face the audience. "In housing fights, in community organizing, in Albany, there's always someone who thinks they can silence you with a camera or a title. But what I've learned is this: power only works when people are too afraid to speak." He turned back to Pirro. "You built your career holding others accountable. But who holds you accountable? Who asks why someone who preaches about law and order is taking money from those breaking it every day in our communities?" The audience was entirely on Mamdani's side now. Many stood applauding. A few even began chanting his name. Judge Pirro looked around at the crew, the audience, the cameras, and saw it clearly. She hadn't just lost the debate, she had lost her courtroom. Mamdani walked back to his chair but didn't sit. He turned to the camera. "This is exactly what's broken in our system," he said. "People get comfortable, they get wealthy, they get famous, and they forget who they were supposed to fight for. They sell their influence, disguise it as patriotism, and then dare to question those who are doing the real work." He paused, his final line carefully delivered. "You asked what I've accomplished. I've done something you haven't in 20 years of TV. I've changed laws, not just talked about them. I've defended tenants, not just lectured them. I've stood up to corruption and never taken a dime from the people who benefit from keeping this system broken." A silence followed that not even producers dared interrupt. Pirro sat there wordless. The last words she always claimed as her own had been stolen in front of millions. Finally, Mamdani sat down. He crossed his legs and smiled. "Now, Judge," he said calmly, "any other questions about my record? I've watched Jeanine Pirro for over 15 years, and I've never seen anyone flip the script on her like that," wrote one longtime fan in a now viral comment under the YouTube clip. Another viewer chimed in, "Zohran Mamdani just gave the entire country a masterclass in preparation. This is what happens when you try to ambush someone who actually knows the system, not just how to yell about it on cable news." Even conservative voices, often hostile to Mamdani's politics, had to acknowledge what had just taken place. Right-wing blogs attempted to defend Pirro, arguing that her consulting contracts were private and had nothing to do with her on-air opinions. But even they couldn't deny Mamdani's performance. "Look, I disagree with 90% of his ideology," wrote one conservative columnist, "but the way he turned her tactics against her, with facts and calm, that wasn't politics, that was skill. Republicans should be taking notes." The mainstream media picked up the story like wildfire. What began as a single explosive segment morphed into a multi-day news cycle with nationwide implications. CNN ran the headline, "Assemblyman outmaneuvers Pirro in viral housing clash." But their follow-up coverage went deeper, launching a full investigative piece into the corporate lobbying money behind political commentators on TV. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow dedicated an entire segment to Mamdani's takedown, calling it a textbook example of how to handle a loaded, bad faith interview and win. The New York Times published a Sunday deep dive titled "The Influence Industry Behind Television Justice," exploring how personalities like Pirro maintain relationships with powerful industries even as they claim independence on air. The Washington Post's fact-checkers spent days verifying Mamdani's documents. Every single piece held up. Their final assessment praised Mamdani's methodical preparation and high evidentiary standard under pressure. International press didn't stay silent either. The BBC ran a feature examining what they called a collision between American populism and grassroots accountability, while Le Monde marveled at the surreal intersection of entertainment, lobbying, and state politics playing out on live television. But it was Fox News' own reaction that surprised many. Tucker Carlson, not known for praising democratic socialists, admitted, "I don't agree with Zohran Mamdani on much of anything, but what he did to Judge Pirro, cool, factual, and relentless, was objectively impressive. That wasn't grandstanding. That was tactical clarity under fire. We should all want our politicians to know their stuff that well." Even Sean Hannity reluctantly weighed in. Her policies are way off base, but Mamdani came prepared, and he didn't flinch. That's what leadership looks like, even if you don't like the agenda behind it. Meanwhile, the damage to Pirro's reputation was swift and severe. By the next morning, the hashtags #PirroProfits and #Mamdani exposes Pirro were both trending globally. Online sleuths unearthed years' worth of corporate contracts, tracing Pirro Media LLC's connections to landlord associations, bail bond investors, and real estate PACs. Things snowballed quickly. The New York Daily News ran a front-page headline, "Judge for Sale, Pirro's Cozy Ties to Landlord Lobby Revealed." The Albany Times-Union dug deeper, revealing that Pirro Media had received over $8 million in the last 5 years from corporations tied to housing policy, eviction defense software, and security surveillance companies lobbying the state legislature. The fallout was brutal. Pirro appeared on The View in an attempt to do damage control, but when Whoopi Goldberg asked her why she never disclosed her business ties while commenting on the very legislation those companies opposed, she had no answer. "Judge, you've built your entire image on calling out corruption," Whoopi said. "How do you not understand that viewers, the public, have a right to know who funds your perspective?" Advertisers took notice. Within a week, 3 major sponsors pulled their support from justice with Judge Jeanine, citing ethical concerns and undisclosed financial conflicts. Pirro's ratings, already slowly declining, plummeted 30% in just 2 weeks following the Mamdani segment. For Zohran Mamdani, the aftermath was the exact opposite of Pirro's collapse. Within 48 hours of the segment airing, his district office reported over 50,000 calls and emails, the vast majority of them overwhelmingly positive. Constituents, housing activists, and even members of the national press reached out to offer support, congratulations, and invitations to speak across the country. Donations to Mamdani's campaign funds skyrocketed, despite the fact that he wasn't facing re-election for nearly 2 years. More importantly, his legislative agenda, once stalled in committee, suddenly found new momentum. The Tenant Dignity and Defense Act, previously stuck in negotiation deadlock, gained 3 new Republican co-sponsors in the state Senate within a week. The Public Housing Reinvestment Act, long considered politically dead, was fast-tracked for a floor vote. The shift was clear. Legislators, even those who disagreed with him ideologically, now respected Mamdani as a force to be reckoned with. "Look," said State Senator Rich Connolly, a moderate Democrat who had once dismissed Mamdani's housing reforms as unrealistic, "I may not agree with all of his proposals, but that performance, that was real leadership. He was prepared, he stayed calm, and he backed up every word with facts. You can't ignore that." Even conservative figures quietly acknowledged the shift in perception. He was no longer just another activist with a platform. He had become something more, a credible, composed, fact-driven lawmaker who could hold his own on any stage. But the implications stretched far beyond just Mamdani and Pirro. The confrontation became a case study in political communication, cited in law schools, media ethics programs, and political strategy seminars. Professors at NYU, Columbia, and Harvard's Kennedy School added the clip to their curricula under courses like crisis management, media literacy, and accountability in public debate. What Mamdani did, said James Carville on his podcast, was turn Pirro's greatest weapon, her confidence, her experience, her platform, into a liability. He made her look like the outdated system she defends. That's political jujitsu at its highest level. The incident also forced a reckoning across the media world. Following weeks of pressure, several other television personalities and political commentators were asked to disclose any personal financial ties to industries they frequently commented on. At least two national media figures were suspended pending internal investigations. In response, major networks adopted stricter transparency policies, and the Society of Professional Journalists updated its ethics guidelines to require full disclosure of business relationships that could influence public commentary. But for many young progressive politicians, particularly first-generation Americans and people of color, Mamdani's performance became something more than just a media moment. It became a blueprint. He didn't back down, wrote Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a tweet that garnered over 600,000 likes. He didn't yell, he didn't posture, he just told the truth, calmly, relentlessly, and unapologetically. That's how you handle a platform that wasn't built for you. You claim it. The confrontation also revealed a generational fault line running through American politics and media. Figures like Pirro, who built their careers in a world of deference, delayed accountability, and controlled narratives, were suddenly confronted by a generation raised on instant fact-checking, public archives, and transparency by default. Their authority wasn't taken at face value anymore. It had to be earned, moment by moment, and in this moment, Zohran Mamdani earned it. If you found Zohran Mamdani's takedown of Judge Jeanine Pirro as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. Who do you think should be the next figure held accountable on live television? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. We're just getting started.